Hi guys, welcome to another Brushmaster video. I'm going to do a tutorial today trying to cover different ways of wet blending and feathering. So this model I painted recently, all the base colours of the skin were done with a wet and wet blending. So I've got a copy of this model and I'm going to show you exactly how I did it. Right guys, so this is the first method, which is what most people call wet and wet or two brush blending, except I do it with just the one brush. So I've got the Bandit model from Bestiarium Games and I've base coated the flesh in violet red. Now the aim here is to paint the shadow colour, which is amethyst blue, and then blend it into the violet red, and I'll be using this size 0 Raphael brush. Now the paint is quite thick, there's not much water in it, so my method for this is to paint two bands on. So I paint the band of amethyst blue, I quickly rinse and clean the brush, and then I paint the band of violet red just above the amethyst blue. Now I clean the brush quickly and I literally scrub between the two, pulling one colour into the other and just adjusting as I go. And as you can see, this just creates a mix of the two colours in the transition area. And I just work along the model bit by bit like this. Don't do too big a bit, because you'll never get it blended in time. So I do it bit by bit, so a small strip at a time, clean the brush, and then blend the two parts together. Now what you'll find, because you can't see the immediate result until it dries, it's best to go around, do the best you can, and then I usually go back and revisit bits where the blend is not quite right or a certain colour is too big, for instance. So it can take 2 or 3 goes, but it's a very quick way to get really nice blend between two colours and a nice transition between two extreme colours. And what I mean by that is you can blend colours of very different values. So as you can see here, the amethyst blue is quite dark and the violet red is quite light. So you can get a really nice smooth transition, which would take you lots of layers and lots of blending if you did it individually. So here you can see here I'm going back to the first bit of blend because the transition wasn't smooth enough, and I just rework it. As you can see here, I've brought the violet red down a bit further into the amethyst blue. So this can take a few goes to get it right and a few times to get the transition right, but the nice thing about this method is you can just go over and over it again and keep doing it until it's right. And once you've practiced this and can almost perfect it, you can do really nice blends in a very short time. I tend to do things like this on a model like this where I want quite a large shadow area or quite a large transition area, and then I'll go on top of the other colours with highlights afterwards with standard layering. So as you can see here, we're getting a fairly nice blend. And while it's still wet, you can still touch it up, but when it's starting to dry, you have to leave it. Otherwise you'll pull the paint up. So this is doing the same, but I'm trying to show you it here on much smaller areas. So for here, I'm just painting in the little crevice under his crossbouts there. And I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'm going to pick up the violet red and I'm going to paint it up there, and I'm going to push the violet red into the shadow area. So because this area is not so wide in shadow, I'm using the paint here to push it into that shadow area to get a much thinner blend, a much smaller blend. And the same under here. So I'm just doing exactly the same. I'm now going to pick up the violet red and I want to put it right on the edge of the blend above it. And it's important to note, I'm putting the paint on quite thick here. It's not thin layers, it's quite thick. You have to be bold how you put the colour on, and don't be afraid to put a thick layer of paint on, because you do need it. Otherwise, if it's too thin, it dries so quickly. You know, and that's no good for wet blending. Here you can see I'm revisiting the bit I done earlier. So I'm just redoing those transitions, just trying to get a smoother blend and maybe altering where the highlight color is going to be. So it's very much a suck it and see type approach. You put a blend on, you blend it in, you move to another bit, and then you just revisit and try to see what needs adjustment, or more of the higher value color or more of the lesser value color. So that's the way I approach it, and it's very much I put it on, let it dry, and then I sit back, I have a look at it, and then I decide which areas need adjustment, and I just go back in and adjust them. The other thing to remember here is I'll also go back afterwards if I can't quite get it right, and I'll mix a glaze of one of the colours, and you can also glaze over those transitions to smooth them out as well. So don't feel like you have to be tied into that one technique. Multiple techniques will work really fine. So this is not strictly wet blending, but I call it wet blending. So for the back of the model, I'm just going to use amethyst blue this time, and I'm going to do what most people would call feathering. So here you see on this part of the shadow, I'm going to lay the paint in, I'm going to clean my brush off, and then I'm going to feather the edges out. So I won't be using the violet red this time. So again, I put a fairly thick layer. This layer is the same consistency, and I get it well into the area. I clean the brush off, wipe it so it's a little bit damp, and then from the edge I just feather that paint out into the rest of the model. And I'll quite often clean the brush a couple of times if there's too much paint, and I'll go back and remove some of the excess paint from the lighter area. This method's very quick. I almost prefer this method at times. Like wet blending, wet and wet, it can take a couple of goes, but it's essentially a way of pulling that paint out into the rest of the model and creating the transition. You know, as you can see here, I'm pulling it out quite a way into the model to thin that transition out. But sometimes it takes a few goes. And the other thing about this method, you can go both ways. You don't have to start from the darkest color. I could, once I've got this, I could lay the violet red down and transition the other way if I wanted to. For me, I just find it easier to lay the dark color down. And as you can see here, it's a fairly quick method. And for getting your sort of base colors and your shadow areas on a model. Like this model's a really good example of, it's quite an unusual skin color, the violet red, and I wanted those really dark shadows. This is a really quick method for establishing those shadow areas, and gives you a really nice base that you can work the rest of the colors into. And again, it's very much a case of you lay the paint down, clean your brush, and then you're adjusting and moving that paint around as you go. So don't think on the first attempt, God, it doesn't look very good, that's it, I've ruined it, or whatever. You very much have to look at this as it may take 2 or 3 steps. So you can put that paint down, feather it out, and then go back to it and go, that bit's not right, or that bit's not right. And you just redo it. It's like under the arms here and there, the transition's probably too harsh. So here, I'm just laying that paint down again, and I want to spread that transition out. I want to thin it out and make it smoother between the 2 colors. The feathering technique like this gives you that really nice ability to spread it out, and it's almost like glazing. You know, the more times you do it, the thinner it's going to get, that transition, and the better it's going to get. So I'll let this section run out for you guys, because there's not a lot I can really say at this point. But you can just watch here how I just keep going over bits, redoing them, and just trying to smooth that transition out. That's all I'm doing at this stage. The main color is where I want it, and this is just smoothing that amethyst blue out into the violet red until I'm satisfied with the transition. So here I'm going to show you a practical example. So the piece of cloth around his middle here at the back, I want it to fade from a nice bright green into the amethyst blue. So here you can see I'm painting the first layer of the green, which is the main part of where the highlight's going to be here. And then I'm going to take that amethyst blue, paint it along the edge, just like we did with the skin. Going to clean my brush, and I'm just going to feather that line between the 2 sections that I painted. Now, as you can see here, it's not always perfect the first time you do it. And as I said in the previous section, you quite have to go over it a few times. It's like here, I've got too much of the amethyst blue in the green, so I'm trying to push the green now into the amethyst blue section. So you go over little areas and then repaint it. And again, this is it with fairly thick paint, so it's going to dry a little bit slower because of the thickness of the paint. I haven't added any retarder in, although a lot of people do, and you can do that to slow it down, especially if you're in a hot, dry country. But for me, from the wet palette, I can pretty much do it as it is. You know, straight out the bottle. There's only a tiny little bit of moisture in the paint, And it's just simply a case of going over those areas again and again. As you can see here, the transition's getting quite smooth. It's definitely getting there. So I'm now going to try, I'm spreading that green highlight out now, and I'm going to use a bit of feathering now at the ends of the green to try and smooth that out. So I clean my brush, and literally from the tips of where I place that highlight, I'm just pulling the paint into the amethyst blue. So the transition now it's working up really nicely, and like the skin, this is quite an extreme transition. You know, if you were layering this, it would take probably quite a lot of layers to get a smooth transition between those two colors. And once I've wet blended this, or wet blended and feathered, a combination of the two, I will then go to each section and highlight them individually with standard layering and glazing. So I'm still trying to get that transition where I want it right now. And like I said, don't be afraid to re-go over bits. See, I've just done an individual fold here where I just wanted the green to stretch out a bit more into the amethyst blue. And that's all I'm doing here. I'm just picking out the little parts where I want more of the light color, or the transition is not quite as I want it. But using this method is a very quick way of painting. You know, if you can master this, you know, you can do fairly large areas on an object quite quickly and get them to a nice, colourful, blended place. So here you can see I've got most of the blend done, but this is another technique I use for blending. I've now taken the green I was using and I've thinned it down with a brush full of water, and I'm just glazing from the amethyst blue into the green. So the areas of the transition where I thought it wasn't quite what I wanted, not quite smooth enough, I'm now just glazing that transition in. So the one thing that's important to remember here with all these techniques is there's no one single technique or one perfect answer for everything. Just in this piece of cloth that I'm painting now, I've used 3 completely different techniques, and I'll do some layering and highlighting in a minute, which will be the 4th technique. So here I'm using the amethyst blue and I'm doing the same thing. I'm thinning that down with a brush full of water, and I'm going to glaze the other way now. So I'm going to be taking from the deepest parts of the folds and the edge, and I'm just glazing that color back. And again, I'm just trying to create smooth transitions and different color values in different parts. And what we'll see at the end is I get a really nice smooth blend, which I can then do the highlighting on. So I'm going to do the layering of the highlights now, and I've added medium sand into my intermediate green to make my first highlight color. And for these highlights, I'm going to place them very close to where my light source is, which is from this side of the model. And I'm not going to go too far into the transition area. So if I start doing that, it will look a little bit kooky. So I'm building these highlights up and just so you can see after a few layers now, I'm starting to build up some really nice bright highlights on this area of the model. And that's all I'm going to focus on here, is just building those up. So I'm just adding more medium sand in now, just to lighten the value of the intermediate green. And the lighter I go, the more those highlights are going to pop. And I want these are going to be fairly small now. I'm really painting the main highlights. I think I may go one or maybe two more layers after this of different color, but not a lot, because the intermediate green and the amethyst blue are quite dark, so it's not going to take a lot to build this color up. And here I'm going to add some highlights to the shadow side, the amethyst blue side. And to create these highlights, I'm adding in some of my intermediate green. So I'm trying to keep the color harmonious, but I only want very slight highlights on here. I don't want this side to pop too much, so I don't want the highlights on this side to really stand out. But I want a little something, just to give definition and some sense of light. And that is the final result of the example, guys. As you can see here, the bright side is nice and bright. There's a big transition between the two colors. And could probably take a little bit more glazing and work, but it's okay. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time for another Brushmaster video.